We're going to first start by talking about the Indian Act, which was created in 1867. It labeled First Nations people as status, and it displaced them off of their traditional lands into reserves. These reserves were also typically not land that was as rich in resources. It disturbed how they were able to eat, and this of course affected their health.
The Indian Act is in legislation till this day and affects all aspects of legislation and First Nation communities, various First Nation communities' governance. The system of the Indian Act has been well known to be discriminatory against First Nations women. The Indian Act has undermined roles and responsibilities of First Nations peoples, and one of the rights that is under the Indian Act is that healthcare is guaranteed in different ways by the federal government. So this can include portions of various prescriptions. This can include dental and medical care.
And this is going to bring us into our next topic, which is Jordan's Principle. So now we're going to explain Jordan's Principle. Jordan River Anderson was a young boy living in Winnipeg, and he basically was very sick. And since the Indian Act says that the federal government should be covering healthcare, but then we also have provincial healthcare, basically what happened is he was in hospital for 2 years, and he then was approved to go home. However, due to the federal government and the provincial government fighting over who was going to pay for what, he spent an additional 2 years in the hospital and ended up dying in 2005 at 5 years old and had never spent a day in his family's home.
For more than 10 years, there had been advocacy work through the Assembly of First Nations and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society to make it so that services needed in various communities would be covered, and that there wouldn't be the fight between the federal and the provincial government of who was to cover these. Under the Human Rights Tribunal, this would make it legal to fund for these services and not have this ongoing issue. Jordan's Principle applies to First Nations people and non-status First Nations people living on reserve, as well as Inuit people. However, the Métis community is not a part of this principle, and that just kind of shows how there is ongoing colonial systems that are disadvantaging the First Peoples of this country. So for health policy in Canada, the healthcare system of Canada is rooted in different policies, frameworks, and government legislation. As we know, the government has not always favored Indigenous peoples, and often they are marginalized on different acts that we'll talk about. So we're going to kind of mention first the Indian Act. The Indian Act, which is still instated to this day, focuses on who is status or non-status under the Indian Act. There's various discrimination policies. The Indian Act displaced forms of traditional knowledge and has many well-known discriminatory policies against women. Disrupting the livelihood of Indigenous peoples has led to health inequities and marginalization that we see today. Under the Indian Act, there is non-insured health benefits, and this is for status First Nations people under the Indian Act and Métis people. So we're going to be talking about specific issues in healthcare that are rooted from the government and colonial policies and legacies. So one of these outliers which stands out is the unethical testing for nutrition and for supplements and vitamins on First Nations children. So in this study under the Department of Indian Affairs, so the government, they would test First Nations children in the residential school system to see if vitamins were working. So they would malnourish them and then check to see if their science was working. And this was from 1942 to 1952, so over 10 years.
Yeah, and obviously the supplements did not make up for the malnutrition, and so children would end up dying from malnutrition. And also, so I'm just going to talk on sterilization, which basically means to make it so that somebody can't have a baby. Basically, the Alberta passed the Sexual Sterilization Act from 1928 to 1972. 1972 is not that long ago, and British Columbia also had a Sexual Sterilization Act from 1933 to 1975. So basically, it was believed that poverty, illness, these sort of things were all due, like, because of your biology, and so they could be passed down for, like, to children. But we all know that poverty is not genetic. It happens due to systemic issues that cause poverty, and it's not those people's fault. Over 100 Indigenous women have come forward saying that they were pressured into sterilization. As well, consent would sometimes be, like, signed consent would happen, but
it wasn't fully explained, nor at times wasn't in their language.
Yeah, so translators were not usually used, and that was of course probably to the people doing these procedures' advantage. And so they were done legally under those acts, and they also have been done illegally.
Judging from an outside lens instead of understanding of the trauma that has been put on them from a colonial legacy.
And sterilization is one of the many violent acts against Indigenous women.
The cultural genocide and ingraining in children's minds that it's not right to be who you are. Those have long-lasting impacts.
Thanks for touching on that, Violet.
Yeah, of course. And it's like important to note that the residential school system was closed, the last one was closed in 1996, although there's many transitions towards the federal government having now they would transition out of the residential school system by creating the 60 Scoop and the child welfare system. Dr. Sydney Blackstock's research found from 1989 to 2012 that Indigenous children spent 66 million nights in foster care. So 66 million nights, to like break that down, so without your family, without, without your supports, without your community. So every night really matters and should be like recognized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is how, culture was taken away. And without culture, we get health disparities. Without family connections, imagine how you would feel without your family. Maybe you yourself don't have a family, and you can see how that impacts your life. So we're going to move on to the next part. Land is so important to Indigenous people, as we know, and it's a part of Indigenous identity. And it can be really hard when that land has been taken away and stripped of its resources.
The different things that have happened and just very negatively impact Indigenous people, and like the most well-known one is say the residential schools, the 60 Scoop, and the child welfare system. There was a pandemic in the 1800s that swept across Canada that was mostly from like smallpox blankets. So that was from these blankets that were bought in with diseases, or settlers that came in and had these diseases and infected different Indigenous nations. So when an outlier that happened was there's the Gitxsan from up north. In their traditional land there was thousands of them, and smallpox was sweeping across their nation during this pandemic. And at the time in Victoria and in the main cities, they had an antidote for smallpox, yet they did not provide this antidote to the Indigenous people of the land. they didn't. They waited till they got very weak. They realized that the Indigenous peoples weren't signing the treaties, and it was colonialism that really just tried to get rid of them. They could have saved thousands of people, yet they elected not to.
Yeah, and there's still ongoing issues such as improper water supply, to reserves. So often, people might think of water quality in other continents like Africa. This is what comes to mind. But these issues are global health issues that we're facing here in Canada right now. Yeah.
So we just see the ongoing effects of colonization that is present in Indigenous people's health. There's an utmost importance to decolonize our minds.
Yeah, absolutely. And something interesting is so often facts are presented without all this history behind it. And I am going to bring in a fact, but I want to recognize that it's not necessarily Indigenous people's fault. And the fact is that Indigenous people tend to live 12 years less than people of non-Indigenous descent. And that, again, is just kind of proof that Indigenous health is not as good as white counterparts due to everything that's kind of gone on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And these health inequities require all levels of increased awareness, of people knowing, of people caring, of people having information about it, of the political commitment to make these better. This is a country of peoples who've existed for thousands of years, taking care of this land and been one with it. Yet we see right now current destruction of our territories and our land, when this is, with 150 years of Canada, this has been shown that it's not sustainable, it's not healthy.
Yeah, and they absolutely can be leaders in our future. So if you are Indigenous or interested in Indigenous ways of being and knowing, we encourage you to learn about those. We encourage you to stand up and to help educate people, because education and information is key in order to address all these health issues that Indigenous people face.